I said to Craig, let's traverse the Southern Alps this summer. And he didn't hesitate and said, yeah. It was a massive project. I spent a full month preparing the food.
Kia ora, and welcome to The Tramping Life, a podcast about hiking in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or as we call it here, tramping. I'm John T, and in each episode I chat with people who share a passion for exploring this incredible country. We'll hear about the tracks they love, the huts they return to, the lessons they've learned, and what keeps them heading back into the bush. My guest today is Robbie Burton, tramper, mountain lover, publisher, and author of Bushline, a memoir. He spent decades leading Potton Burton, one of New Zealand's most influential independent publishers. I'm delighted to welcome him to the podcast. Kia ora.
Nice to be here.
What are your first memories of being in the outdoors?
I was lucky enough to grow up in Nelson with a mother who was a great lover of the bush and the outdoors. My first real experience was my best friend's parents had a batch at a place called Torrent Bay, which is in a little enclave of private batches in Abel Tasman National Park. And in those days, we're talking here the early 70s, it was really remote. There was no real tourism. The odd tramper, the tracks were overgrown. The tourist boats hadn't really got going. And that was a hugely influential part of my life. Between the ages of 5 and about 15, I probably spent a month a year down there. We used to go down for all the school holidays. And that was marvellously the cliched sort of free-range New Zealand childhood. We were left to do our own devices and just spent our time mucking around in the lagoon and on the beaches and fishing and walking and all of that sort of stuff. And my mother was a huge influence on me. She loved the forest and the bush. She was a great amateur botanist. And her and I used to walk the tracks often, which I loved. But that progressed in my teenage years as I discovered skiing at the little club field at Mount Robert in Nelson Lakes National Park, which in those days was incredibly healthy, vibrant club field. It still got plenty of snow. It was an hour and a half walk into the huts. So it was a mixture between tramping and skiing. And I became obsessed with the mountains as a teenager. It was my great teenage obsession. I loved skiing, but then I discovered tramping. And from, I guess, 14 or 15, I remember my mother let us walk into Lake Angeles, I think when I was 15, on our first sort of tramp. Again, no one around. I'm sorry to play the nostalgia card, but it was very different to what it's like now. I went to the local boys' college, which was not a happy experience for me, to be honest. I was the wrong person at the wrong time. I just wanted to grow my hair and be naughty, and that didn't go down well. But what they did have was an outdoor education centre on the fringe of Nelson Lakes National Park. And that was a huge revelation to me. I loved it. And you could become what was known as a leader, which all it meant is you went for a walk for a week with another teacher, and then you could take out groups of third and fourth formers tramping, which you would never be able to do these days. It was very loose, I have to say. But I loved it, and I scanned the system in my last year. I think I spent 6 weeks in my last year at high school tramping. So by the time I was ejected out into supposed adulthood, I was a great lover of the outdoors, and it was the central focus of my life, which was wonderful, really. I feel very privileged.
Were there any memorable learning trips, I guess, if you're leading at such a young age, where things may or not have gone entirely to plan?
Yeah, there was a teacher we had whom was a very experienced climber. He took us for our leaders course, and I'll never forget that, because he, although we didn't realise at the time, quite deliberately pushed us one night. We'd taken ages to get over a pass in the head of the D'Urville Valley, and we were all a bunch of 16-year-olds, and he wanted to push us a bit to see what we were made of. And he made us walk. So we had a big day, and then he made us walk till 11 o'clock at night, I think it was. And we didn't have torches or headlamps, and we stumbled down this valley trying to find the track, and he kept on pushing us on. And I've never forgotten, I've still got a scar on my arm, actually, where I tore it open in a piece of kānuka. But we finally got to this clearing, and he made us cook dinner and made us pitch our tents, and I'll never forget that. And we didn't get to bed till after midnight. And it was, at the time, a horrendous experience. But by the time the next day, I felt puffed up and like we'd actually done something hard. And actually, it was a wonderful thing. I wasn't someone who was into the sort of hard man sports, rugby and such like. They weren't my thing at all. But when I look back now, I think it was an important step in actually discovering another way of being a bloke, a bit of masculinity, really. That was a real eye-opener. I could realise that I had never thought of myself as being particularly tough. Not that I am tough, but realised that you can push yourself a lot further. It was a very memorable experience, but luckily I didn't have any close shaves or nearly kill anyone, as others did. But that was a very formative experience. It was great.
Who have your tramping companions been through your life? Do you do solo tramps or through tramping clubs or friends?
I was lucky. My older brother, Pete, is 7 years older than me, and he was, at the time, my now business partner, Craig Potton's best friend. And that's the connection, actually. And Craig and Pete took me under their wing. I'm 6 or 7 years younger, but they took me under their wing. And I think they were the most significant influences on my tramping and mountaineering experience, because they started introducing me to mountaineering. They both were more experienced than me, and we started having regular climbing. Was in the easy peaks and Nelson Lakes, and then that progressed to coming with them on Christmas trips down to Mount Cook. And without a doubt, Craig and Pete were hugely influential. I was very lucky, actually, that they would tolerate a much younger kid on their trips. And we were a very happy team. My brother Pete's a very natural mover in the mountains, and he's very good at it. And Craig had huge stamina for a thin, rangy guy. He could walk all day and keep a sense of humour. So they were great company, and I was very lucky. But they were the primary people that got me into the hills. Obviously, as I got older, that expanded out and I made lots of different friends. But I was never really aware of tramping clubs and that sort of thing. I had the luxury of being able to choose my companions, which was great.
And I spoke to Craig. He's got a few back issues due to heavy patsy, he claims. Do you have any similar ailments? Were you carting 30 kgs of camera gear around?
No, I don't have any issues. I'm incredibly lucky now because I'm now pulling a pension, so I'm getting on. Through my sort of midlife period, I didn't do nearly as much tramping just because I had kids and chose to spend my time with them. But in recent years, over the last 5 or 6 years, I've really got back into it. And I'm really lucky, actually. Touch wood, I keep fit and make sure that I keep some strength up. So I'm lucky. I don't actually have any issues. So while I've never been naturally that strong, it's always been the thing that's dogged me in the hills. I'm not someone with natural stamina, but I know that I can push myself and I know that I can still do it. And it's a great joy to be in my position and still get out there, and I can still put on a pack and walk for a long time. It's great. It's still one of the great joys of my life to be able to do it. I don't have the stamina that I once did. And I gave up mountaineering when my children were born because I did not want to be a dead father. So I restrict myself to tramping these days very much.
Yeah, that's a sensible approach. Looking back, what were some of the most physically or logistically challenging trips that you did?
I don't know if Craig talked about this, but the most significant thing that I did when I was a 20-year-old was my brother Peter and another friend, Paul Roy, did a traverse of the Southern Alps. So we started from Milford and walked home to Mount Robert, Nelson Lakes. That was possibly one of the defining experiences of my life. None of us were especially gifted or leading kind of mountaineers or trampers. It was just an ambition that was dreamed up once we thought this would be a good thing to do. I know exactly the spot. Craig and I were walking back from a winter climb in the head of the Traverse Valley and walking around the lake. I said to Craig, let's traverse the Southern Alps this summer. And he didn't hesitate and said, yeah. And that meant my brother Pete had no choice but to join us. It was a massive project. This is, remember, before D-High Food, before Polypro. So we're talking 1980. This is now ancient history. I spent a full month preparing the food, and that was a full-on job, actually getting that organised. We got these big tins that we got from the local health food shop and stored everything and soldered the tins up and then got them dumped wherever we could. Many of them we could leave and dock what were then Lands and Survey or National Park headquarters, and some we flew in and walked a few in as well. So we had food dumps all the way up the Alps and set off from Milford in early January. And it was an amazing experience. We struck, unfortunately, one of the worst summers weather-wise that had in years. Of the 90-odd days we were walking, I think we had something like 40 lying in huts or under bivouacs or in wet tents. And then we got incredibly fit. So, of course, what would happen then, we'd get a day when it was fine, and then we'd take off and do 2 days walking in one, which was how we got up it. What I loved most of all about that experience was just everything quietened down. You got really used to it. I loved that. Just became completely at home in the hills, and it was the world was left behind. And I found that a very profound experience. I've still been looking for that, the kind of silence we had by the end of it. You just don't get that with week-long trips. It's not the same. It was an amazing experience. Nelson Lakes, if I was able, I would have happily turned around and set off back. Would have been no trouble to have done that. But life unfortunately called. The biggest challenge actually was hunger. I found it. We just simply couldn't carry enough food. Until we got to Arthur's Pass, we were carrying ice axes and crampons and ropes and stuff. So we had, and tents, and was all white spirits and heavy food. So we had big loads. And that meant that it really restricted the amount of food that we could actually eat. I think I was a bit younger, and the others at that stage, they'd all taken tobacco, which is what we used to do in those days. And I decided not to because I thought I'd end up as an addict, which I probably would have. But anyway, I've really suffered with the food because we were just hungry. And the only reason actually we pulled the trip off was because in those days there was hut food everywhere. So especially between Mount Cook and Arthur's Pass, we got caught in a huge storm in Murchison Hut, which lasted, I think, 6 days. Dumped a whole lot of new snow, and we ran out of food, but we decided to carry on, and we kept on finding food in the huts we went through, which was what saved us. And the Forest Service huts often still had leftover food from the colours, was still accurate. So it was hut food that kept us going. It would be very different now with D-High. It would make a huge difference. That's been a revelation to me, how light you can actually go, but we didn't have that luxury. We got to Park Morpeth Hut and up head of the Wilberforce, and we'd been forced off the main divide by bad weather and passed through one of the huts from one of the high country stations and had a huge big sugar bag of potatoes, and that had obviously been brought in for the muster or something. And there was a note on the top saying, help yourself. So we took some potatoes, which was great. We had that night, but the next day it was pouring. So Paul thought this is too good an opportunity. So he walked for hours down the valley in the pouring rain and hours back with this huge sack of potatoes, which we then proceeded to boil up the entire sack. It's all we had was potatoes in a camp oven, until the point of which we were just lying on our bunks just groaning. It wasn't a pretty sight, but it's pretty confronting how animalistic you turn into when you're starving. So yeah, that was an interesting and unexpected side to that trip.
On the theme of huts, do you have any particular favourites in your heart?
Oh, that's a hard question. The thing that I loved most were the rock bivvies, Harper's Rock and the head of the Douglas, which is a tributary of the Karangaroo. It's quite hard to get to now. That place was amazing. And I loved Arawata Rock, which I was lucky enough to get back to a few years ago. That's an incredible spot. They were really good. There's just terrific huts everywhere. Places like Godley Hut at the head of the Godley was just amazing. The huts at the head of the Wilkin, I remember those as being, we'd had a terrible time up the East Matuki in a storm, and having those beautiful huts to stay in was great.
Are there any particular memorable wildlife encounters?
I remember seeing tar in the head of the Douglas, which gave me a fright. I'd never seen them before, walking around a corner and seeing a huge big bull tar and thinking he was going to charge me. That was worrying. What was really striking is that at that time, the deer wars, the venison recovery had absolutely exploded. So I don't think there was a fine day in that 3 months where we didn't hear a helicopter or see a helicopter. So that was full on. So we didn't see deer much because they were all being hunted so hard and obviously were wary of humans. Of course, the thing we did see, and which has completely changed, is kea everywhere, and huge flocks of kea. They were just to be expected, which of course you very rarely see now, only in patches.
You said there was a bit of a gap raising family and work between your early years of tramping and your later years. What kind of changes had you seen over that period?
One of the big changes, obviously, is gear. I've loved the way that it has neatly tied into my aging body, is all this lightweight gear. We clumped up the Southern Alps in a pair of Transalpine Galibiers, which were a French brand, and they had a half shank in them. And I hate to think what they weigh because they got wet, obviously, on the first day and never dried out for 3 months. The tents we had were useless, heavy and leaked. The discovery of really good quality D-high meals changed my tramping life. It's just brilliant to actually go out, pack for some days and only be carrying whatever it was, 10 kgs. I remember having packs on that big trip in the Landsborough, which were nearly 30 kgs, I think, or something. You couldn't lift them. You had to get onto a log. I don't miss that. I really don't miss that. PLBs is an interesting one too. We had no communication at all. none whatsoever. So we had no forecasts, no way. We chose not to take a mountain radio when we did the traverse. And again, having a PLB, frankly, is great. I think it's a really comforting thing to have. I think one of the sad things that's obviously going to happen is with Starlink and such as people having access to all the media in huts and in the backcountry. I don't want to sound like an old cronk, but I think that's sad. Sit in the hut and someone's watching a movie. But hey, can't do anything. That's a personal choice, and I don't have to do that. But it can be very intrusive.
How did you get into the publishing business, and what was the first tramping-related book that you published?
So I got into it purely through nepotism, which was through Craig. We were close friends and we'd worked together in the conservation movement, and I'd gone on to do something completely different. He started the publishing company and realised very quickly that it needed someone to actually drive it, and he didn't want to do that. He was a photographer and also doing tons of conservation work. And so one day he invited me to lunch, which I thought was weird, and made me an offer and said, why don't you come and manage the publishing house? It was quite a hard decision because I was doing some very interesting work, but it didn't take long for me to actually think this is a fantastic opportunity. So I eventually said yes. And I was the first sort of full-time employee, and he had a part-time person with a little warehouse and a part-time person doing some accounts. But back when I got going, which was 1990, there was a huge gap in the market of photography that Craig was doing. He really led the charge in terms of taking photos that were of wild places that were moody and dark and interesting, and had got going with a little range of calendars and some books, and they'd done really well. So it was, in retrospect, a fantastic timing. It was somewhat improbable, though, Jonty, because I had no experience. I'd written a guidebook about national parks in 87, I think, commissioned by Reeds to do that. And so I had some very slim insight into that world. And I'd done some, in those days, sort of basic layout on bits and pieces of projects, but I really was a complete amateur. So that was pretty challenging. That said, Craig had the entrepreneurial sort of spirit to set it up, and he too hadn't actually come from a background, but he was sick of having his books murdered by other publishers and wanted the freedom of doing it. So that's how it started. And here we are, whatever it is, 35 years later. It's been a fascinating career. I think the first real tramping book was actually with Sean Barnett, and we did a tramping guidebook, which we combined with some 3D maps, overview maps, that had been done by a guy called Roger Smith, who was an innovative cartographer with a company called Geographics. And at the time, they're now passé, you see them everywhere, but at the time they were completely radical. And that book sold incredibly well because people had never seen it. It had these sort of 3D overviews of tramps. And that was the start, I think. And we went on to do lots with Sean and with Rob Brown and various people around that sort of area. It started, which was a wonderful fit for us to be able to do outdoor books.
So how does that process work? Are you commissioning work or authors coming to you, or a bit of both?
A bit of both. I used to, when we were small, getting going and no one knew who we were, I used to have to commission the books largely. But these days, pretty much everything is just being offered to us. There's more than I can deal with. Commissioning is very hard because there's a huge lead-in, and also because no authors can make any money out of books now. Unfortunately, you can't make a living as a writer in New Zealand, which is very sad. So people have to be passionate about it. And there are, happily, still people passionate about doing it. The one that you've talked with Rob Brown and Sean Barnett and Jeff Spearpoint's book on huts, Shelter from the Storm, which we first did, I think, 12 or 13 years ago, was a real turning point for me, a landmark book, I think, that really genuinely helped to change the conversation around how precious huts are. It was part of a picture. There's lots of people doing stuff permanent on the West Coast, but that book, I think, was a real turning point when it was realised that at that time, Doc were thinking about pulling huts out. I think that really stopped that slide. So that's been a great privilege to do those kinds of books.
You've ridden the wave of publishing in the 90s and 2000s, and they sold well. And when did things start to slip?
The big change for us is that how I grew this publishing house was the easy money, if you like, was doing scenic books of landscape photography, which sold in huge quantities to tourists. And they were not necessarily very interesting publishing because they're pretty formulaic, but that's completely died. Interestingly, that was huge, and that's just gone. There's two main reasons for that. Mostly it's social media and the fact that everyone's got a phone with a camera on it, and they're obviously getting really good. And I think the idea of going out and buying a book with beautiful photographs is quaint now. I think people just wouldn't occur to a young traveller to do that because they've got all their own photos. Plus, the quality of cameras and the digital revolution has really changed that. So people are able to take photos of much higher quality than they were 20 years ago. So that's completely killed that market. So that's been a big shift for us. I reckon it's probably in the last decade, we've started to see a real slide in the number of books that people buy. And that's got really tough recently. But it's always hard to unpick what's going on with the recession, which is very real. That plus the cultural change I think we're seeing is really strong. There are just so many different ways to entertain yourself now. And I find that fascinates me how I actually have to put aside time to read, and I love reading. But once you line up podcasts, which I'm a huge devourer of, Spotify, because I'm a music buff, anything you want streamed, to be honest, I think very enriching offering now in terms of how the world can come to you. I love it. But people don't read. They just don't read as much as they do. And if they don't read, of course, they don't buy books. So I think we are seeing some real challenges ahead especially for the New Zealand publishing industry, because it's all about economies of scale and we simply don't have the population to front it. So books are not going to go away, because if you're publishing in a big market in the US or Europe, for example, even Australia, the numbers are completely different to what we can do here. So I think the New Zealand ecosystem is really struggling, would be my reading of it. And again, the huge problem is that authors can't make a living. So I think that's very sad, because that just diminishes the number of people around to tell our stories and to do that. There's still people out there who are utterly passionate and do it, but that's very different than what it was 30 years ago.
What about the rise of ebooks, just in terms of reducing the cost to publish?
Ebooks have stabilised out, and they're a really significant market, especially in genre fiction. So science fiction, romance, crime, thrillers, that sort of stuff. Especially if it's books that people churn through, ebooks I think are huge. And obviously in the scholarly market, they're enormous as well. And so we do ebooks, but just for the New Zealand market. We'll only generally do them for text-only books. Converting a big illustrated book into an ebook can be done, but the economics of it just don't stack up. The great growth market, obviously, in publishing in the last 5 or 10 years has been audiobooks. But again, the cost of producing an audiobook for a limited market, unfortunately, the economics of this stuff just doesn't stack up. And there's a huge problem with ebooks is that if you produce an ebook, it cannibalizes the physical book sales. So you're faced with a dilemma there that's not straightforward.
How did you come about writing and publishing your memoir?
Oh, that was an interesting one. It started out as a very personal project. My father died when I was a 3-year-old, and I didn't know him at all. And I was sitting there one day, and I've got 2 sons, and sitting there one day some years ago thinking, I'm sad about the fact that I don't know who my father was. Really, I didn't know who he was as a human being, and you don't think to ask those questions before it's too late. After my mother died, I regretted the fact that I hadn't interrogated her, but it was awkward. She was with another partner and things, and I didn't really do that. And I thought, I should write this down. I should actually write something down for my children. And so I started just doing that. And I was telling a friend of mine, authors I've worked with a lot and publishers, and told him what he was doing. And he said, oh, for God's sake, turn it into a book. You're a freaking publisher. And so I thought, okay. So I did that. I turned it into a full sort of memoir and found the process fascinating. I'd always wanted to write. I've always spent my life being the midwife to other people's writing. Anyway, I self-published 70 copies of this little memoir, which I gave out to all my friends at my 60th birthday party. And then about 2 or 3 people in the room knew I'd done it. And so it was a fantastic occasion and very amusing, and people were stunned. Anyway, that book started getting passed around, and I started getting emails from strangers saying, I love this book. So I thought, oh, maybe I should take this more seriously. So I used that as the basis and turned that into my own memoir. The original book I did had nothing about my work as a publisher. And I was really reluctant to write about that, frankly, because I thought it would be boring. But that's not what people are interested in, seeing what the machinery of publishing is like. So I used that first book and then expanded it out. And it's been a actually fantastic process for me, to be honest. I've had tremendous feedback from people. It mixes a whole lot of things up. Obviously, that's very personal about my own life and the hard bits and the good bits, and a lot about the outdoors and a lot about publishing. And I determined that I like books where people are honest, so it's quite an honest book. Someone just said the other day, actually, that is how intimate it was. So, yeah, I've had a fantastic response. Tons of people have contacted me about it. And so that's been really gratifying. It's been really nice to be both actually have written something as a publisher, to actually be on boots on the other foot. And I loved the process. Genuinely loved collaboration. I really liked having good editors on the case and tearing my stuff to shreds. Luckily, I didn't mind it. I just made it a better book. So it was a really rewarding process.
Do you think you have a second book in you?
Actually, I've just written a text for a children's book, which a friend and colleague of mine who's an illustrator has been working on this story for years and asked me to actually see whether I could come up with a text, which I've done and which we'll publish next year. And it's about the castaways of Disappointment Island. That's a ship that Dundonald ploughed into this little rock off the Auckland Islands in 1907, and their story of survival is just extraordinary. Amazing story. It took them, whatever it was, I think it's 7 or 8 months before they were eventually rescued. But it's a marvellous story of human ingenuity and survival. They had to build this little boat out of tiny pieces of wood to get across to the main island, and it's an incredible story.
I was speaking the other day to Victoria and Emily, who's publishing a book with you, which is Emily's perspective on the Tierra. The children's books, is that a market that's still viable?
It is. Again, in decline, actually, interestingly. But again, is that the recession? I suspect it is. I think it's probably the most robust area of publishing still, because inevitably and sensibly, people don't really want to have their kids reading an iPad at bedtime. And Emily and Victoria's story, and Emily Walks the Te Aroa, and it's just been published. It's great. It's really very different. I could find nothing really like it because it's a photographic book about their trip. Very inspirational as a 7-year-old. Another children's tramping book that we did a couple of years ago, which I really enjoyed and which was supported by the Mountain Safety Council, was written by Gillian Candler and illustrated by Gavin Mouldy, and it's called Leo and Mia Go Wild, which is a lovely sort of primer about tramping in New Zealand. Yeah, we do some children's books. It's a relatively small part of our list, but then we're a relatively small publisher, John. We used to do a hell of a lot more, but we've cut our cloth to deal with the declining market. At one point, I was doing 20, 25 books a year. It's now down to about 10, which is about all I can cope with, and it's good. It's a nice number to work with.
So just to finish off with, what's on your tramping bucket list?
That's easy, but don't have one. I just feel really grateful that I can get out there, and I don't really care where I go or what I do. But if I can get out there with friends and with family, I just love it. Where I am in Nelson, if you go to the Port Hills or to the beach, you look across at Mount Arthur, Wharepapa, and I keep on discovering. I did a beautiful trip with a whole bunch of friends on the Lewis Pass tops last summer, which we just walked along for 4 days or something. So I'm lucky. I don't have anything to prove.
Thank you so much for listening to The Tramping Life. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow the podcast in whatever app you use. Tell a friend about it and consider leaving a rating or a review. It really helps more people discover the show. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email at thetrampinglife, one word, @gmail.com.